we're back for our second talk about non-chord tones. We're going to be on page 187, talking briefly about passing tones. Passing tones fill in the space between two other tones, often a third, like a D between a C and an E, or possibly a C sharp between a C and a D. There are other details we can learn about it, so let's look at example 12.3, the Mozart Symphony, Jupiter Symphony, first movement. Begins like this. And so forth. So the very opening of this theme has a G in the chord, followed by a G sharp ascending, and then ascending again to an A. So we see it as an ascending passing tone. It is a G sharp, not in the key, so it is a chromatic ascending passing tone. And it's not on a strong beat. In fact, this is probably cut time, so it is halfway through beat 2, so it is an unaccented passing tone, and it has less than a beat. So altogether, it is submetrical, that means less than a beat, chromatic, ascending, and unaccented. That's kind of a mouthful, and we'll generally just call it a passing tone. Okay? Let's look now at the neighbor tone. We're skipping over to page 195 because the section on counterpoint we are already going to be covering as we incorporate non-chord tones into our chorale phrases. So the neighbor tone, again, can be chromatic or diatonic. There's a great example in the Schumann. Just play with me the upper voice. Now, if I leave out those neighbor tones, so you see it gives interest going up from the G, back down to the F sharp. So it's interesting, the A neighbor is an upper diatonic neighbor. The F sharp neighbor is a lower chromatic neighbor, depending on whether or not they're in the key. Okay, let's do suspensions and retardations. And retardations I'm going to talk about briefly first, then we'll spend the rest of our session on suspensions. Retardations, there's a little bit on page 198 about them, and they're basically common at cadences, and they'll appear sometimes with a suspension. In other words, they resolve and go up. A suspension at the same time might hold over and go down. So let's talk about the three parts of a suspension. First, the preparation, then the suspension itself, and then the resolution. There's a good example of this on example 1213, page 196, where I have a sixth, an E and a C. Then the bottom voice steps down to a D. My C is still held over, at which point it becomes a suspension, and then it steps down and resolves. I'd like you to see how this suspension is created. I'm going to write this first without the suspension. So we have the E and the C, upper voice and lower voice, and then we go to the next chord. Looks like that, right? When you're going to write a suspension, you look for a step down like that, like this upward voice. Now I'm going to put a suspension in. So I'm going to move this over to here, and I'm going to extend my C. I can tie it or replay it. So this is the preparation. this is the suspension, and then we have the resolution. Notice that the value of the half note here was cut in half because the suspension took half of the note value. Okay? So we have various numbers of suspensions. Let's look at this one. I have a D up to a C, and I'm sure you realize that's the interval of a seventh. Then when it resolves, it goes down to a sixth. So we would call this a 7/6 suspension. In fact, the numbers are so important that instead of writing suspension, you will just write the number. Okay? Let's look at these different types of suspensions on example 12-13. So we could have a 7/6 the way you saw here. We could have a 4/3. The 4/3, I have an F in the bottom, and I have a B flat that goes down to an A. So I start with the B flat, and then it goes down to the A, a 4 to a 3. I could have a 9/8, which holds over and resolves down to an octave. The 9/8 is the only one where the note of resolution is already present because it's an octave. Let me show you what I mean. So it's resolving down to the B flat. If there were already a B flat present here, there wouldn't be any suspense. Okay? So generally the note of resolution is not present. Of course, if it's resolving to a B flat octave, I would have the B flat to show that it's an octave. There is one suspension where the number gets bigger instead of smaller, and that's if we have a suspension in the bass. Look at the example 12-14 again with me, the last measure. You see we have a chord with a B flat in the bass, and then I keep my B flat. It's a very lovely one, and goes down. So the B flat against the C, make a second to a third. Okay? Sometimes the bass note changes from one chord to the next, but I still have a suspension because of the way it's held over. This is called a suspension with change of bass. Look at page 197 and play that with me. So first we're going to play it without changing the bass. F sharp and D. The F sharp moves down to E. The D is held over and goes down to the C sharp. That's a 7/6 suspension, just like this. Now I'm going to change my bass. The way it's written here, the E in the bass now goes up to an A. Okay? You notice you still have the suspension, but it goes to a third now. So this is not a 7/6 suspension, this is called a 7/3 suspension with change of bass. Pretty fancy. Okay. There are some other details. A suspension figure, you might find the seventh acting as a chord tone. We'll call that a suspension figure, and we'll be talking about them later. And you might have a series of suspensions. Look at page 198, where the resolution of one becomes the suspension of the next. So I could go like this. Do you hear how it can keep going? Suspension, resolution. That's a chain of suspensions. Okay? And that brings us to just the last section, which is talking about embellishing a simple texture. So on page 200, I want to talk about, again, how to find a suspension. Okay? First it says find a step down if you're looking in the bass, you'll find a 2-3 suspension. Okay? So it's possible I could have made the suspension here. I could have held my E over and gone down. Alright? But when you're finding a bass suspension, you must have the note above it to make a second. You have to have that number of a second to a third. So if you find a step down in an upper voice, remember there are 3 choices. You can have a 7th to a 6th, a 4th to a 3rd, or a 9th to an octave. There are other possible numbers, but they don't make good suspensions. For example, if you had a 5th to a 4th, that certainly is a step down, but it doesn't create any tension. So those 4 numbers I mentioned are the ones that we'll deal with. Okay? I'd like you to look at the checkpoint, page 201, and then we'll just briefly go to figured bass and lead sheet symbols. There's a chart there that summarizes it and tells you what symbols to use for each suspension. Okay?